To get started on this exercise, you should have downloaded the project resources, which consist of the heavy lifting Adobe Animate file, and also I'm giving you an animated GIF that shows you exactly what the final product should look like. Though keep in mind, notice that it has the little reference sketch behind it. When you double click and open the heavy lifting animate file, here's how we have it set up. The first thing I would do is to show all so we can see everything that's in the frame, and also let's have a look at our timeline. You can see that our timeline has two different folders plus a background. For now I've turned the background off, but if you want to view it, it's just the guy inside of a simple little gem. We'll keep that off for now. Also, you have a rough animation folder. If you open this up, this is what the blue outline and gray outline of the rock is all about. This is going to show you exactly where your character should be along the time and how to animate him as we go throughout this entire project. So the timing and pacing has all been mapped out for you for exactly what to do. What we want to focus on, returning back to frame 1, is the cleanup. Under cleanup, this is where you have all the different parts of the person that you're animating. And if you click on the eyeball icon, you can turn it on and see all of him. So the first thing we want to do is to work on the cleanup layer to have it match the rough animation layer that's below it. Now, if you're following along with the book, this first section is simply going to ask you to place keyframes in all of the different layers for each of the parts of the body and have it match up with the keyframes on the rough animation layer. We're going to take this one part at a time, then go back and animate everything in between. The first thing I'm going to do is go back down to my timeline and increase it so I can see all the different parts of the body, including my rough animation. And I'm going to hold down my space bar and place it right here. Let's take this one thing at a time. So I'm going to return to my timeline and turn off visibility for all of these layers just by clicking and dragging on it. And let's do the rock layer first, simply because this is the simplest thing. With the rock layer turned on and all the other layers nice and locked down, I can select the first frame. Now I want to be able to see what's below my rock layer as well. So with that rock layer selected, we can right click on it, go to the very bottom and open up the properties, and let's drop down the opacity of this layer so that we can see it a little bit better. So click on opacity, you can see it's already set to about 50%. When we say OK, this will drop the opacity of this layer and make it much easier to see. Now I can step forward in my timeline, each keyframe, and see what's happening along the way. What I'm looking for is a keyframe where the rock starts to move. In this case right here, you can see there's a shift happening at this keyframe and this keyframe moment on, looks like frame 83. So I'm going to select frame 83 for my rock layer. With that one, we'll hit F6, insert a keyframe. Then I can select the rock and use my quick selection tool. And I can see the rock is being rotated into place. So I'm going to rotate it and then use my arrow keys to nudge it into place right here. Next, we can go to the next keyframe. It goes up. So we need to insert a keyframe here, F6. Then move the rock upwards. It's going to rotate just slightly more. Move forward another keyframe. Insert a new keyframe and move it up. And rotate it and place it right where it needs to be. If your rock is off by a little bit, that's okay. Here's another change. Move up, move forward. Here's another slight change. Insert a new keyframe. The arms will move. Stepping forward, oh, here's another keyframe, F6. Going back down to my timeline, we're moving forward again, hitting the period key to move forward, and here's a major change here. So we'll hit F6 to insert a keyframe there. Moves up and rotates. Stepping forward, moves up again, hit F6, rotate it into place. Move forward. Slight change here, F6. Move forward again, F6. Moves down. By the way, I am using my arrow keys to nudge this into place. Then moves down to here, F6. And then move forward again, F6. And then move forward again to its final resting place right here, hitting F6, and then selecting it and moving it back up. So now if we return to our timeline, this is our rock layer that we have, and all we've done is matched the movement of the rock on its timeline to match the movement of the rock on the rough animation layer. So if I was to scroll back, you can see the rock will also move and pick up as it moves along as well. If we want, we can now return to the rock layer and right-click on it, open up the properties, and let's return it back to 100% visible. We'll say OK to that. And even if you wanted to test this, you can go to Control and Test, and you should be able to see the rock being moved into place. Now keep in mind, the person won't move. Instead, you're just going to see this rock kind of lifting into place and being roughed out from here. With this done, now let's go in and add the appropriate motion tweens in between each of these keyframes. Now what we don't want to do is simply add a motion tween between all of the keyframes. Pay close attention to the action that's happening on the stage. At some points you want the rock to rest, and at some points you want it to start at a certain time. So for instance, these first few keyframes, the rock is obviously going to be staying at rest until he reaches this keyframe and it starts to move. Once it starts to move, it goes from here, then he pauses at this keyframe. So as I'm looking, I can see the movement happens between keyframes number 83, and then the pause happens on keyframe 91. This means I only need to insert a movement or a tween between here. So I'm going to choose a classic tween for frame 83, a classic tween for 85, and a classic tween for 87. This way it slightly moves up. It'll pause here for him to readjust his hands. And then from here it drops back down and starts to move up again. Let's move forward in our timeline. Now right here you can see he's going to drop down and get almost like a little quick lift before he finally lifts it up. So I'm going to do one more thing. Even though it's not indicated on the rough animation, this is the point in which he dips down a little bit more. So I'm going to back up a couple of frames, and let's have this be the starting point to move from the position where he's up to go where he moves down. So inserting a keyframe just a few frames before, hitting F6, this is where I'll start my motion tween or my classic tween to this position. So he moves down, and then from here he'll lift up, and you can see he's pausing at this moment to readjust his hands. So by frame 34 is another pause. So I can insert some classic tweens up until that moment for there. Since this moment's a pause, we won't move a tween, but then he'll move back down into position for all of these. So I'm going to select the rest of the frames and insert a classic tween between all of those. Excellent. So notice what we've done. Going back to frame 1, pay attention to the action on the screen when he's pausing and when he's readjusting his hands and when the rock is actually moving. Between there is where you can add your motion tween. So now if we go up to Control and test our movie, you can see that the rock is going to be moving in a much more fluid manner. And then back down. With the rock part done, Let's repeat that same process for the rest of the parts of his body. Now, I'll give you fair warning. Some of these body parts are going to have some unique challenges, so along the way I'll stop and I'll point out how to fix each individual part. But for the most part, all of this is going to be exactly the same. So let's return to our timeline. Since I'm done with the rock, I'll turn off the visibility for this, and let's work on his lower leg. So this particular part needs to match the lower leg of our rough animation. Going back to frame 1, also, while I'm here, let's see, we'll turn down the opacity of this and we'll turn off our rock layer. So I've turned off the visibility for the rock. Right click on the lower leg and open up the properties. And let's set the opacity for that lower leg to be a little bit more opaque so I can see it. Moving forward, using my period button on the keyboard, we'll go to the next frame, in this case here. And then I'm going to zoom in so I can see it better. And I'm going to rotate the leg into place. One thing I will point out is they've moved the rotation point of the leg right where it needs to be. So all you need to do is click up here and drag it and move it ahead for here. Moving forward to the next keyframe, we'll insert F6, select the knee, and move it forward with here. Repeat this process until you get all of the keyframes set for where the leg needs to be. Alright, with all the keyframes done for the lower leg, now let's go back in and add the appropriate motion tweens. You can see for this first one there's going to be a movement between these two, so let's do classic tween between those two as it moves down. He's going to pause here, and then there's a slight movement between here, and then pulling back very quickly. And then there's a pause right here as well. So all of these need to have a motion tween between them. To make it easier, I'm going to hold down Shift and select all of those. Let's do a classic tween between each one of those. So now each one has its own movement. There's a pause. So he readjusts his hands. Then moving forward in the timeline, you can see it picks up as it moves between all of these. So let's go back down to our timeline. Just as I've added an extra keyframe for the rock's movement, let's do the same thing for the leg movement. Inserting a keyframe here, pretty much all of these have some sort of movement. So holding down Shift, I'll select all of those keyframes and insert a classic tween for each one of those, giving it some sort of movement along the way. Again, if you want to, you can go up and test the movie. This time it'll look kind of bizarre, but his leg's going to be moving along with the rock, but you can see how it moves along with this as well, nice and smooth. Returning back to frame 1, I'm going to lock down my guy's lower leg and let's unlock the upper leg. Now I want to be able to see where the lower leg is that I've animated, so I'm going to keep that one visible, but I am going to open up the options for the upper leg, the properties, and let's reduce the opacity for this one as well. Now we can work on keeping the upper leg in line with the rough animation as well as the lower leg that we've placed where it needs to be. The process for this is going to be exactly the same as we've done with the lower leg and the rock. I'm going to move through looking for each change in a keyframe and then adjust the position of this leg to match a new keyframe that we set up. Once all the major keyframes are now in place, let's return back to our first keyframe and let's insert our motion tweens. I can tell you that the motion tweens for the upper leg are pretty much going to match the motion tween needs for the lower leg. So wherever you see one on below it, that's what we're going to place here as well. So let's insert one for this one. Moving forward, select this one and hold down Shift and select all of these. Actually, we don't need that last one, so let's get this for here. We'll insert classic tweens for all of those. We can move forward. Just as we've added an extra keyframe here, we need to do the same for the upper leg, so hit F6. And then we can hold down Shift and select all of these keyframes. And let's insert a classic tween for those. And now let's test out our movie. Go up to Control and test and see if there's any awkwardness between the movements of the legs. See, it moves down, pulls back, and then goes back up from there. So far, so good. Let's close this out and focus on the rest. Let's zoom back out to see everything. And we'll return to frame 1. Since we've got the upper and lower part of his legs done, we can lock down all of those. The shoe itself is not going to do any major movements. So for this one, I'm actually going to skip over it and just lock it down so I don't accidentally make any movements to it. We'll even keep it off for now. The next thing that I would focus on isn't the neck or the body, but we're going to focus on doing the head. So I'm going to turn on that layer, select that layer. Let's go down to the option properties for it. Let's lower the opacity of the head so we can see it. Again, selecting frame number 1. This is where we can place all the keyframes for the position of the head. Then we'll go back and animate it just as we've done the body. So moving forward on our timeline, you can see the first movement is here. So we'll place it. There's a slight rotation. Again, using our arrow keys to nudge it into place. Then using the period button to move forward. There it is there. Rotate it into place. Move it up. What I'm doing to make sure it's nice and aligned is basically looking at the nose to make sure the nose is in its proper position and alignment for here. The other thing you can look at is the position of the rotation for where his neck meets, trying to keep it in that same spot where the spine would be. Moving forward, hitting the period button. This is where he'll start to look up at this keyframe. So from here, we'll simply do a rotation. Now that we've added all the keyframes, let's return back to our first movement keyframe. And this is where we need to start thinking about how he's going to be moving the rest of his body. If I zoom out to see all of this, I'm going to have him pause for about half of a second. So I'm going to start the animation from this position, let's say around frame 12. We'll hit F6. From here, I can insert a classic tween to have his head move from this position down to here, and then finally moving from there down to there. So we'll insert another classic tween between this one, down to that position. From here, this is where he wants to pause before looking up. And we don't want it to be an abrupt look up, so before it reaches frame number 65, let's insert a keyframe before it. There we go, F6. And then we'll insert a classic tween between those. This way it slowly moves his head up. He'll pause before moving forward. So we don't want it to go between this keyframe to here. We want it to be a few frames before. So let's insert a keyframe at frame 74. And we'll do a classic tween between this movement. It moves forward and then quickly back to here. So all of these will get a classic tween. This will move the head back and up into position. And we need to add one more classic tween in my case for this one right here. Now from here, this is where he's readjusting his hands so his face will not move. We'll move forward. And then from here, he starts to move his head forward and back into a movement here. So just as we've done with the others, let's insert one more keyframe that aligns with all of the keyframes here. In this case, or in my case, it's frame 122. And let's insert classic tweens for all of this movement. This way the head moves and stays with it. Let's go up to Control and Test and see how this head movement works. So the head pops off, which is always kind of funny, moves up, and then moves into place as well. With all of this done, now's a good time to save up your document because we're going to be moving into some of the harder parts of the animation. So I'll go up to File and Save As. Do make sure to put your name in front of it. We can still call it Heavy Lifting and save it as an Animate document. So in the second half of this project, we're going to be animating the upper and lower portion of his arms, the rest of his body, and also transitioning the hands.